All right, guys. Yesterday on Monday, we talked about foreign policy and just went through and we addressed, I think, 16 big questions. Um, Maybe you watched the crash course at the end of the PowerPoint to give you a little more context on all of that. But today, we're going to continue talking about foreign policy. And then when we're done with this PowerPoint, we're going to go up here. And this is a website called isidewith.com. And it's considered a very reputable website. And they just publish polls, a poll basically being asking the American people's opinion. I guess it doesn't have to be American people, but in the case of American civics, this is the opinion of American people. So anyway, bear with me. I'm getting a little sick. No, it's not COVID-19. It's just allergies, but please pardon me if I cough. All right. So let's get going. American foreign policy. There's the United Nations building. It's a pretty cool image with all these flags. All right, so foreign policy refers to the plans and actions a nation takes in every aspect of its relationships with other countries. Things like diplomacy, military action, commercial action, etc. Includes all the federal government's official statements and its actions as it conducts foreign relations. A country that is as influential as the United States, our statements alone can have a lot of sway on global politics. Often, a country will use a public statement, an official statement, as a way to essentially as a form of a threat, or if not a threat, certainly saying, laying out like, this is what we want you to do. And just the rules of the game are such that if country A tells you, if the United States says, this is how you should handle this, and you handle it that way, then it stands to reason that you would be rewarded for that. So examples include alliances, international trade, the defense budget. We talked quite a bit about that yesterday. Foreign economic and military aid, and the UN, nuclear weapons testing, and disarmament negotiations. Let's keep going. Don't you freeze on me. Oh dear. Let's try that again. Some policies have been in place for a long time. One of them, freedom of the seas. And that is essentially allowing countries, at least member countries, to travel the seas freely. You have what they call international waters, and then in certain spaces, their waters controlled by a specific nation. But freedom of the seas is one example that we point to as an element of foreign policy that's been the same for a long time. Others are more flexible. An example of that being our relationship with first the Soviet Union and now Russia. We go from, it's really been a pretty similar story with Russia for a long time now, which is that neither country is particularly fond of the other, but we each recognize that the other country can provide some sort of a service, or that a relationship of some kind with them would benefit the United States, or in the case of Russia, would benefit Russia. So there's this very delicate game of cat and mouse when you're dealing with another superpower, a superpower that is not an ally, but that demands to be cooperated with nonetheless. Um, that's the former Secretary of State, a guy named Rex Tillerson, and the Spanish Foreign Minister, Alfonso Dastis Quesedo. That's them posing for a picture. They're meeting at the U.S. Department of State in Washington, D.C. The State Department is the department that handles most of our foreign policies. So now the current Secretary of State is a guy named Mike Pompeo. I don't know if you remember talking about him when we learned the notable politicians. This thing's really going to make me X out and in, isn't it? So we won't spend a ton of time talking about this because it's something that's come up time and time again. But initially, our foreign policy was pretty strict isolationism. As World War One started rolling around, initially we resisted the urge or the call from some people to join fighting, to actually send troops. But we were not being an isolationist country because we were providing hundreds of millions of dollars to to our allies in Europe. We actually provided about 28 to 30 million to our enemies, to our future enemies. But over 200,000, excuse me, over 200 million dollars of aid sent to our allies over there. So even before we completely abandoned the isolationist mindset and actually sent troops to the war, even before that, we were sort of talking isolationism, but in reality, we were still trying to play a hand in foreign affairs. We sort of readopt isolationism after World War One. There's been this thought on the part of a lot of Americans, the Americans who tend to have a more of an isolationist mindset. There's been a lot of thought from them. Sort of the common refrain is we keep using the term foreign entanglement. So this sort of common refrain is why are we getting involved in something that's halfway across the world, that's across an ocean. But again, like World War One, when World War Two rolls around, again we're sort of reluctantly drawn out of our isolationist stance. We tried to, just very similar to World War One, we tried to remain neutral in sort of big air quotes, but we were still giving hundreds of millions of dollars to our allies. And then ultimately, when the United States was attacked on our home soil during the Pearl Harbor bombings, Pearl Harbor attack, we again formally threw away the isolationist mindset and we went to war. Now, in 2020, we have a huge hand in events all over the globe. Part of that is one element of foreign policy that we talked about yesterday. Part of that is military. Our military is stationed in countries all over the world. Another part is, and this is a phrase that we've used up to this point, talking about Congress, talking about the House of Representatives, but another form of American foreign policy is economics. And specifically, it's using our considerable wealth, the wealth of our empire, it's using that money to influence policy decisions made by other countries. So we do use military force when our leaders feel that it's necessary, but the bread and butter of U.S. foreign policy is economic action. and that's economic action. Again, not meaning necessarily that if you don't play ball with us in terms of trade that we're going to attack you, but just that if you don't do what we want you to do, we're not going to provide the assistance or the financial aid that you need. So I do love a good old political cartoon that looks like the two kids from The Cat in the Hat. But it says, and the wolf chewed up the children and spit out their bones. But those were foreign children. And it really didn't matter. This actually was Dr. Seuss, um, otherwise known as Theodore Geisel, my fraternity brother, Sigma Phi Epsilon. What up? So she's reading about Hitler. She's wearing a turtleneck that says America First. And essentially, you guys can tell what this means, right? It doesn't take a genius right down there. It says, but those were foreign children. It really didn't matter. That's being critical of, speaking to, addressing this isolationism and how, as the Nazis were ramping up their efforts in Europe, the calls for U.S. involvement got stronger and stronger. Isolationism and internationalism. The State Department is a. Let's go back, shall we? Hang on. Sorry, guys. This has been a real pain in the butt. So, where were we? Isolationism and internationalism. Wars and other political upheavals abroad have an impact on the U.S. When we say abroad, you guys probably know this, but we're just meaning across the ocean. Threats posed by rogue states can threaten American security. Again, that's not states as in Georgia, Alabama, Florida. That states as in other countries. And rogue just means sort of going off and doing your own thing. It's usually, or a lot of times, it has a negative connotation. Economic conditions elsewhere in the world also have a direct effect on the U.S. Policies that promote the security of all nations can assure the security and well-being of the U.S. So the State Department. The State Department, it's a federal executive department responsible for carrying out U.S. foreign policy and international relations. It was established in 1789, and it was actually the nation's first executive department. That should tell you something. It should tell you the importance that the founding fathers put on foreign diplomacy. Its duties include advising the President of the United States, administering the nation's diplomatic missions, negotiating treaties and agreements with foreign entities, and representing the U.S. at the UN or the United Nations. It's a large department. The State Department has a budget of almost 50 billion with a B dollars. It's about, last estimate was like 47 billion, and almost 70,000 employees, like 69,000 employees. So it's a huge, huge department. Organized along both geographic and functional lines, includes the Bureau of African Affairs, the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs, etc. So we have bureaus, or the State Department has bureaus prescribed to to each segment or to little segments of the globe. Other agencies have broader missions, such as the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, that's trying to combat international drug trade. But you can see, hopefully, that there are many roles that the U.S. plays, and that really all countries play in helping to hopefully maintain some semblance of peace and order. So the Secretary of State, there he is, big fella. That's Mike Pompeo. The first one was Thomas Jefferson. The first female Secretary of State was a woman named Madeleine Albright. I remember that from when I was a little kid. I wasn't really too plugged in because I was a 12-year-old, but I just remember that name. The first African American was a guy named Colin Powell. This is really cool. At the time, I didn't care at all, but in about 1999, I guess, Colin Powell came and spoke to my school. And in hindsight, that was a really big deal. But it's just one of those things that when you're young, you don't appreciate. I'm sure you guys all would because you each have a thirst for knowledge. But, at the time, I just didn't care. Still, though, that's pretty neat. And the first African American woman was a lady named Condoleezza Rice. Condoleezza Rice is a Republican, and she was Secretary of State under George W. Bush. So it's the highest ranking member of the cabinet. It's actually the third highest official of the executive branch of the federal branch of the U.S. So you have the president, the vice president, and after the Speaker of the House, the Secretary of State. Secretary of State and Speaker of House. So let's keep going. We're plugging along. There are over 13,000 people represented just in the U.S. Foreign Service. Members are selected through a series of written and oral exams, and they could serve at any of 265 U.S. diplomatic missions around the world. It's created in 1924 by an act called the Rogers Act. And it was basically, it combined all what we're going to call consular and diplomatic services of the U.S. government into one administrative unit. So it just combines all these different services into one unit. The U.S. Foreign Service, it's managed by a position called Director General. And an official, he's an official who's appointed by the president of the U.S. I probably don't have to keep saying U.S. with the advice and consent of the Senate, or at least that's the system that's been in place thus far. Usually, the Director General is a current or a former foreign service officer. The process of being employed in it, it includes, an initial application, a qualifications evaluation panel, oral assessment, clearances and final suitability review, and then the register. So step one in becoming that is the Foreign Service Officer Test, the FSOT. It's a written exam consisting of 3 sections of job knowledge, hypothetical scenarios. So, like if A happened, how would you handle it? If B happened, what would you suggest, etc. English grammar and usage, and an essay. Those who pass the FSOT then submit short essays called personal narrative questions, and they're going to be reviewed by a panel, the qualifications evaluation panel. So we won't keep going. There are more elements to that process, but we'll go ahead and keep going. This is Colonel Joseph Martin. He's commander of the 2nd Brigade Combat Team Dagger, and he's pinning the Superior Civilian Service Medal on John Creefield. He's a foreign officer with the Agency for International Development. So, foreign service members, they do play an important role. International law, the rules and principles that guide sovereign states in dealing with one another. Under international law, every nation has the right to send and receive diplomatic representatives. Sources of international law include treaties, decisions of international courts, etc. And you can see that's the International Court of Justice. So, ambassadors. The foreign government to which an ambassador is assigned must first approve the person. In some cases, the foreign government might reverse its approval by declaring a diplomat persona non grata, NONGRATA. In other words, just an unacceptable person. This kind of declaration usually results in recalling the ambassador to their home nation. And in accordance with Congress of Vienna, so according to what the Congress of Vienna in 1815 and the Vienna Convention, Vienna tends to be it's been the location of epic historical moments numerous times. The 1961 Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations says that the ambassador and embassy staff are granted diplomatic immunity and personal safety while living abroad. That idea of diplomatic immunity is really an interesting concept, and we'll get a little more into that. So they have 3 main duties. They are supposed to protect citizens. So, as an officer of the Foreign Service, an ambassador is expected to protect the citizens of their home country in the host country. They are supposed to, in other words, if you're the ambassador to England, you're expected, at least in theory, to protect the citizens of America living in England. Support prosperity. In other words, when 2 nations are conducting a trade, it's usually advantageous to both parties to have an ambassador, maybe a small staff living in the other land. Then this ambassador and this staff can act as an intermediary between cooperative businesses. So basically, the staff and the diplomat can be the middleman between different governments, different countries' governments. And then they work for peace. At least that's ideally one of the cornerstones of foreign policy, of foreign diplomatic meetings, missions, is to work for peace. So these are all, yesterday, I think we mentioned the word idealistic. Sure, arguably idealistic, but an important cause nonetheless. Ambassadors are appointed by the president, may be a career foreign service officer or other political appointee. Sometimes it's just a way of rewarding someone who has been supportive of your political career. And we've had some celebrity ambassadors or diplomats, and we'll look into that tomorrow, probably tomorrow. But that's a lady named, that's the president of Taiwan. Her name, I believe, is Tsai Tai Huang Wen. That's what it is. And she's posing with a guy named John Huntsman, who was ambassador to Russia, and he used to be ambassador to China. So he's a very experienced foreign diplomat. So usually they serve about 3 years. And political appointees, once they're so these foreign service members, once a new president comes in, typically they're going to resign. And what that does basically is just gives that new president, an opportunity to appoint his own people. We do also have, from time to time, special diplomats, special ambassadors, envoys, representatives, and coordinators. Those are positions like ambassador to the UN, global AIDS combat. There was pretty good global cooperation when the AIDS epidemic broke out. Nuclear non-proliferation, or just trying to limit different countries building up of their nuclear weapons and stuff like that. That guy is named Adlai Stevenson, and he was the fifth U.S. ambassador to the UN. So now in 2020, we're on the 30th ambassador, but Adlai there, he was the fifth. And one reason that he's such a well-known ambassador is that he was in office in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So he was an officer during a major time of foreign turmoil. All right, let's keep cruising, shall we? Diplomatic immunity. I mentioned this before. Basically, it says every sovereign state is supreme within its own boundaries. In other words, the U.S. law is the supreme law in the U.S. Chinese law is the supreme law in China. But ambassadors, if you're lucky enough to be one of them, you have immunity. And basically, that means that you're not subject to the laws of the state to which you're accredited or assigned. Now, does that mean you could walk up to somebody and murder them without getting in any trouble? No. But it does mean they can't be arrested or sued. They can be expelled, so they can be kicked out of the country, but they can't be arrested. One major problem, or a major example of why this creates difficulty, is just ordinary laws. Like diplomats, they double park. There's a place in Germany, a stretch of road called the Autobahn 555, and it was nicknamed the Diplomatierbahn, or the Diplomatic Raceway, because back when that was the capital of West Germany, numerous diplomats were known for speeding down the highway. So certain cities have taken to impounding cars. Rather than finding the owners, they will impound their cars. And diplomat status doesn't guarantee you the release of an impounded car. So slide 16, last but not least. Passports. A travel visa is a document that shows you're allowed to enter a specific country for a specific length of time. You'll sometimes hear about student visas to do a specific thing, right? Study or work. So unless they submit a waiver, our government requires visitors from other countries to get a visa before visiting the U.S. And with regards to American tourists, some countries require visas, some do not, and some base it on your length of stay. So we're just about at our time limit. You guys are going to have a short assignment called Day 2 assignment. Good job. Let's keep